Welcome to As-Sahwa's podcast, encouraging revival of the mind and the heart, seeing the truth and standing for what is right in the age of overloaded misinformation. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace to you all, and welcome to episode 3 of our series of the situation in Palestine and Israel. And as I promised, in this episode, we're going to be speaking about what was known as the Arab Resistance or the Arab Revolt. This is your host, Uthman Abu Mike, and we are hoping to learn, to talk, to discuss, and to engage. So let's kick off with the episode. Just a small recap on what we mentioned before in terms of Zionism and how Zionism was connected to what was known by Zionists as the line of defense, but can be seen by others as an act of terrorism, act of extremism. We saw how Zionist paramilitary groups such as the Haganah became so violent towards the Arabs and eventually started conducting operations and terrorist attacks against the British Army in Palestine and in Britain as well. So having this in mind, let me just remind you of the quote in 1920 by Weizmann, the first president of Israel, 1948 to 1952. "We will establish ourselves in Palestine, whether you like it or not. You can hasten our arrival, or you can equally retard it. It is, however, better for you to help us so as to avoid our constructive power being turned into a destructive power, which will overthrow the world." So firstly, even Weizmann acknowledged the region named Palestine. He didn't call it anything else, he called it Palestine. Secondly, you can see in his threat that you need to hasten our arrival, right? And if you don't, his second threat is our constructive power will be turned into destructive power, and the last threat, which will overthrow the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, you can clearly see the mindset of the Zionist and the Zionist takeover of the land of Palestine. Now, how did the Arabs react to this? This is what we want to see. When we look at the situation in Palestine, in Israel right now, we see that Palestine is the aggressor. Palestinians are the ones that are attacking continuously, and Israel is this only democracy in the Middle East, and it's like the underdog, and it's combating terrorists all the time, and dealing with the situation there is diabolical. And how can it come to this? And this is why it's important for us to go back in history and to see, to take the facts, and for us to understand and comprehend it. So there's no doubt here the situation took place where the Arabs were promised a Palestinian state during the British Mandate, as well as the Jews were promised a homeland. And the reason why I'm using this wording is the idea that the British had was that Palestine would be more or less governed as a Palestinian state, but there will be an area for the Jews to reside in. Now, what we saw was the unrest, the animosity that grew between the Arabs and the Jews, because both were promised something It kind of sounds a bit like what the British were doing quite regular. And I'll go back towards places of India. When the partition, which we were going to mention later, when the partition that was created in 1947 between Pakistan and India, how that went into chaos as well. So in 1930, Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam, he organized a small group which was anti-Zionist and anti-British. It was more of a militia than anything else. What they did at that point was they started to destroy anything that's kind of connected to the British Army. So, things like phone lines and transportation links. And during this time, many organizations were formed, political ones, even like women's groups and scout groups and that kind of thing, to really get the revolution, in a sense, started. Between 1936 to 1939, there was a complete, what was known as the Arab Revolt in Palestine. So things like in 1936, there was general strikes, and strikes that occurred, for many months. And I want you to kind of just really comprehend what we are talking about here, okay? The Jews were promised a homeland, security, and asylum, because the Jews weren't there. Physically speaking, they were not there. They all came from Europe. Okay, let's be honest. At least 70 to 80% came from Europe, right? And we know that. We've discussed the numbers already. A small number came from North Africa, maybe some from Egypt, some from Yemen, East Africa, but the majority came from Europe. Now, by this time, the Palestinian Arabs were upset that they're not getting what was promised to them. After the Ottoman Empire had dissolved, the land was taken, or was given, the British mandate by the League of Nations. And in this chaos, the king of Britain, also agreed that the Jews will have a national home. What's to point out here is in 1935, the Jewish population grew from 57,000 to 320,000 by the support of the British, right? So, just to make it absolutely clear, the numbers grew. How can the numbers grow so much? It can only happen if there's mass migration to the land where the Jews had not resided in those numbers for around 1900 years, 1900 years. There was not a Jewish community of that number. So just keep that in your mind now, please. Right? Now, there was periods when the Zionist paramilitaries, such as the Haganah, it was renowned as a terrorist organization, and then, as we said, later on became the Israel Defense Force. They worked alongside the British because the British could no longer handle the Arab revolt. But the strange thing is, they are also the same organization that were helping the British to crush the Arab revolt, but then again, as we mentioned, turned on to the British when they weren't getting what they wanted to get, i.e., the whole of Palestine to be under the Zionist rule. Now, don't forget the fact that Britain were the ones that actually trained a lot of these Zionist paramilitary terrorists. So it kind of came back on them. Now, as a side note, in 2009, there were a weapons cache that was found in a synagogue named Hod Hashoron synagogue, dating back to 1948. Just making a side note here, because We hear a lot about weapons found in the hospital, which again we'll speak about because that doesn't even make sense. Weapons were found in the playground in Gaza. Weapons were found, I think they even mention them also. So it's kind of really clear here that when there is some sort of revolt, revolution, you will find that many people were involved, and the ones that actually saw it as being a revolution would not really tend to give up the ones that are involved in revolution. So keep in mind Palestine, keep in mind South Africa, keep in mind Ireland, Northern Ireland as well. Keep in mind, other parts of Africa that were coming out of the colonial powers and calling for a revolution, calling for freedom. So you've seen what's happened in those countries. So not much different to what is happening or was happening in Palestine at that time. Now, the British also were complicit in these crimes. An example is that they would get the Arab rebels, make them an example, and during the time, the Lieutenant General Haining, he was the general officer commanding, right? He reported to the cabinet on the 1st of December 1938 that practically every village in the country harbors and supports the rebels and will assist in concealing their identity from the government forces. Okay, let me give an example. The British at the time took 50 Arab rebels, around 50 Arab rebels, and blew them up, made the prisoners watch, and then made the prisoners bury them. And you might say to me, how's that possible? Right? The British would never do that. Listen, these are not my words. Let me give you an example of how the British forces used Arab prisoners as human shields, a tactic often used by the Israeli army, the IDF, who was the Haganah paramilitary terrorist organization. Arthur Lane, who was in the Manchester Regiment, he was a private, and he said, when you'd finish your duty, you would come away, nothing had happened, no bombs or anything, that the driver would switch his wheels back and to make the truck waver, and the poor wog on the front would roll off into the deck. Well, if he was lucky, he'd get away with a broken leg, but if he was unlucky, the truck behind coming would hit him. But nobody bothered to pick up the bits they were just left. We were there, we were the masters, we were the bosses, and whatever we did was right. Well, you don't want him anymore. He's fulfilled his job, and that's when Bill Usher, the commanding officer, said that it had to stop because before long they'd be running out of bloody rebels to sit on the bonnet. Wow. Now, if that's not a witness statement, then what is it? If that's not an admission, and you know what? Is that not a war crime to use anyone, even prisoners, and to torture them in that nature and to leave their bits hanging there? Now, you even had the Royal Air Force who participated in protecting the British forces and anything to do with the British forces. Okay, and it also were complicit in bombing campaigns on the so-called rebels. The British forces also used another Jewish paramilitary, another terrorist organization, and they called them the Special Night Squads. Now listen to what Colonel Administrator Sir Hugh Foote has said about these terrorists. He said, as extreme and cruel, involving torture, whipping, abuse, and execution of Arabs. This is the Jewish paramilitaries, terrorist, extremist, special night squads. But it was all done with the British forces knowing what was going on. The British government was absolutely aware what was happening, and they kept silent, and they allowed the extremist paramilitaries to continue doing what they continue to do to the Arabs. Now, I suppose in a sense, the ultimate aim for the Arab revolt was to make the British sick of Palestine. As the Major General Bernard Montgomery concluded, the Jews murder the Arabs and the Arabs murder the Jews. This is what is going on in Palestine right now, and it will go on for the next 50 years in all probability. Now, he's absolutely spot on, because we are, well over 75 years, and you can kind of see what's going on in Palestine right now. So by this time, the British had absolutely enough, and they were sick and tired of the situation. They just wanted to get rid of this mess that they created in the first place. They were running out of foot soldiers. This is a time where the British Empire was kind of coming to an end. You had the chaos in India where there was rebellion. And what they feared was if they brought the Indian soldiers to Palestine. Now, majority of the Indian soldiers in the British Army were Muslim. They were sympathetic to their brethren in Palestine. So they decided, you know what, we can't do this. We can't bring them here because they are going to be, they're going to take the sides of the Palestinians. So it's best to keep them there. Now, they had that chaos. They didn't have much arms. They were running out of finances as well, really and truly, because, war cost money at the end of the day. So literally what the British did is they said, right, we've had enough. We're just going to dump Palestine now. We're just going to run away. We're going to leave it in its chaos. And the new United Nations, who the hell do they think they are in the first place, decided we're going to divide the land. And we're going to give majority to the Jews living in Palestine who were not indigenous to Palestine, who just arrived, majority of them from Europe, right? Okay. And they only made 35% of the population at that time, around 35%. So majority of Palestine would go to them, the small 35%, and the majority, who were the Palestinians, will only have a minority of Palestine. Now, the note to make here is also just to remember, again, the Jews were promised a homeland, and the Palestinians were promised a state. But it all got not just confused, but it just literally got messed up by the British Mandate, and the United Nations. They caused utter chaos in this land. Since 1948 and its so-called independence, but independent from what? I don't know, because they came as asylum seekers, and then suddenly they had a war of independence. They didn't fight no one, really and truly, as a war. Who did they fight? The British? No, the British ran away. The Arabs were in chaos, right? And by this time, they realized that the British aren't going to be helping them anymore. So they began to buy arms from the USA and places like Czechoslovakia at that time, and other countries. And they began their own production, because now they had the experience of paramilitarism and the training from the British. So with this, they were able to form a government, and was recognized by United States and the Soviet Union and some other countries, but there wasn't a majority at that time. Now, by this time, 1948, the Jews began to clear out villages and cities in Palestine and pushing the Palestinians out slowly and slowly and slowly. They were pushed out towards Egypt. They were pushed out towards Jordan. The idea was that Egypt would take control of Gaza and Jordan would take care of West Bank, right? But what was happening is a lot of the Palestinian refugees, they started coming into occupied Palestine and carrying out small attacks on Israelis. The Israelis, in return, with their armies, would attack villages in the West Bank and Gaza. You had the famous Gibeah massacre, Unit 101, commanded by Ariel Sharon, who carried out a raid and killed around 60 Palestinian Arabs in Gibeah. Now remember the name Ariel Sharon, because he very later on, becomes a prime minister as well of the state of Israel. And it's strange how these commanders of the Haganah terrorist paramilitary organization also became prime minister of Israel. Israeli army also attacked Egyptian, Jordanian and Syrian posts in and around Palestine. You had the famous Kafr Qasim massacre, where up to 49 Arab civilians were killed by the Israeli border police as they returned home to the village from their work. 1959 saw the Egyptian-born Yasser Arafat form Fatah, and their aim was to conduct guerrilla warfare operations against Israel. 1964, you had the Palestinian Liberation Organization formed in order to dismantle Israel as a state and to wage an armed struggle. 1967, you saw the so-called Six-Day War, where Israel actually conducting a surprised attack on the Arab countries, absolutely smashing the Egyptian army or the Egyptian Air Force. Their jets hadn't even come into the air. They were still on the tarmac where the Israelis came and bombed them. 1969 saw the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It was formed by George Habash, who was a Palestinian Christian. So not only were the Zionists oppressing the Arab Muslims, the Palestinian Muslims, they were also oppressing the Palestinian Christians. Now, throughout this time, from the formation of 1948, formation of the State of Israel, and I think it's best to call it the Zionist State of Israel, not the Jewish State of Israel. Anyhow, from that time throughout, you found that there was a lot of assassinations by Mossad, killing many Palestinian leaders, not just in Palestine, but in North Africa, in Europe, around the world. They had the right to go somehow in other countries, international countries, and assassinate these leaders. Okay, but they also did a series of letter bombings. The Israelis would send letter bombs to assassinate Palestinian leaders, and then the Palestinian Resistance Organization will also send a letter bomb to Israelis as well, and that killed many people. Let me bring your attention now to 1982, where you saw a massacre in Sabra and Shatila. Around 3,500 civilians were killed. Refugee camp, Palestinians were killed, and the Lebanese Shia. By whom? And now this is a city, near Beirut. Oh, sorry, these are areas near Beirut. Okay, and this was during the Lebanese civil war, where there was a war between the Christians and the Muslim population as well. But this massacre was perpetrated by the IDF. The IDF decided to enter Lebanon, go into a sovereign nation on the pretext of fighting against Palestinian resistance groups and fighting against terrorism, went right up towards Beirut to these two places, Sabra and Shatila, surrounded it, blocked all the exits and the entrances. No one could go in and out, and then allowed the Christian militia to enter. For 2 days, they allowed them, 2 to 3 days, they allowed them to cause carnage, a rampage of murder, rape, and torture. This is the reality of the Israel Defense Force. Listen, read about it yourself. See the United Nations reports. Read the eyewitness accounts. Read whatever you can, even if it's Wikipedia, whatever you can find. This is the purpose of the podcast, is for you to understand the reality of what is going on. 1987, Hamas was formed by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, more of a political organization, as there were disputes amongst the Palestinians on how they would free Palestine. You had the first Intifada between 1987 to 1993. I'm not going to go into them as much because really and truly, I'm trying to give you an understanding of how these resistance organizations came about and the actions they took. And I'm not justifying, I'm saying in reality how and what happened. Now, during these intifadas, there was demonstrations, there were rioting, there was, boycotting. There was, there was chaos in these intifadas. But these intifadas happened because of the continuous occupation of Israeli forces, the bombings, the attacks, the assassinations, the oppression that was actually caused upon the Palestinians that was supposed to be the Palestinian territories. Hamas was, like I said, more of a political organization. And then in 1991, you had Al-Qassam Brigade, which became the military wing of Hamas. And they began their operations. And some of the operations they started were suicide bombings, right? Where their soldiers, their fighters, because they're not really soldiers, their fighters would strap explosives and go to the Israeli checkpoints, or maybe go to some of their soldiers, the Israeli soldiers, and blow themselves up. Now, this was a period where it was quite chaotic. It was like tick for tack. The Israelis would invade Masjid al-Aqsa or the Al-Aqsa Mosque or its surroundings. Then Al-Qassam Brigade and other organizations would do an attack on the Israelis. You had the settlers coming into Palestinian territories and growing their settlements, killing Palestinians. And what would happen? These perpetrators would get arrested, would be taken to court, and then they would agree some sort of like blood money. They would agree with the Palestinian families a compensation. Hardly any of these settlers, any of the Israeli Defense Force soldiers were convicted. Many of them were convicted, but hardly any of them faced jail or even executed, really and truly. I don't know if they actually have any executions in Israel, but they did not face any kind of custodial sentence for killing Palestinians. In 2004, the Israelis assassinated Sheikh Ahmad Yassin, who was the founder of Hamas. 2007, Hamas wins the elections and takes over Gaza. What we need to establish right now is the reasoning of these organizations that came about, reasoning of these Palestinian resistance groups. Somebody might want to call them terrorist organizations. But what was the reason for them to cause such chaos, to cause, in their eyes, a resistance against the occupied? And I want to remind everyone again, even the United Nations, which had no right to divide the land of Palestine, Britain had no right in having its mandate in Palestine and allowing foreign immigration of Jews from around Europe and other parts of the world. They had no right. But even when they did so, and the chaos they did, and they ran away and left the situation of Palestine, this is the fruits of what we are seeing right now. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have spoken about the resistance organizations, and these resistance organizations will continue until there is some sort of remedy. And that's why I want you to join me in the next episode. What we are going to be speaking about is there a solution for this situation in Israel and Palestine? And will they be able to live together? Could there be a two-state solution? Or is there going to be a one-state solution? Or are we going to continue to see what is happening in Palestine, in Israel, for another 50 odd years? So please, join me again in the next episode. Let's learn, let's discuss, and let's engage.